After a 4th of July party in 1994, Chris Steiner went to bed. Around 10 p.m., his dad went to go check on him, and he was still fast asleep, so he was like, all right, I'm going to bed too. The next morning, his parents went to go wake him up, and Chris was gone. At first, the parents were like, oh, he probably snuck out to go to like another party, because he was a teenager, that's what they do. But then they noticed that the window screen was slashed. There were muddy footprints on the ground, and the patio door was unlocked, which was unusual for them. And that's when they were like, okay, we need to call the police. So the parents called the police, and at first the police were like, oh, maybe he just ran away. Kids do that. But once they heard about the evidence that was found, they were like, okay, we need to take this more seriously. Unfortunately, 6 days later, they would find Chris Steiner unalived in the Wisconsin River. Welcome to Curious True Crime. July 29th, 1995, in Baraboo or Baraboo, Wisconsin, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Thad Phillips was being carried from his new home to somewhere else. And Thad thought, oh, this is just my dad carrying me to bed. Thad was around 13 or 14 years old, and his parents still regularly carried him to bed when he would fall asleep on the couch. So he was like, oh, this is just my dad carrying me to bed, whatever. So he stayed asleep. And he was woken up when he was put on the ground. And Thad wakes up and he's like, whoa, where am I? And he was in front of an unfamiliar house with an unfamiliar person. Now, this unfamiliar person was around 17 or 18 years old, so Thad thought, oh, this is probably one of my brother's friends. But the unfamiliar person said, hey, my name's Joe, come in my house. And Thad, being half asleep, was like, well, okay, I guess, like, sure. Thad went inside the house with this Joe person. When they got inside the house, Joe was like, hey, let's go upstairs to my room. So Thad was like, well, okay, I guess so. Thad would actually say that in his gut, he just had a feeling that he shouldn't, but he did anyway because he was scared. So he did go upstairs with Joe, and they would sit on Joe's dirty bed. Ew. And they would talk about cars and baseball cards and stuff like that for a while. And then all of a sudden, Joe's demeanor just completely changed. And he pushed Thad onto the soiled bed and just started twisting his right ankle until it snapped. Joe weirdly got up and put his hands over his face, almost like he was like ashamed of what he had just done. And Thad took this as an opportunity to run. So he ran as fast as he could with a now broken ankle and got down the stairs, got into the kitchen, and unfortunately was caught by Joe in the kitchen. So Joe drags Thad to the couch and starts to bend Thad's leg forward so that way it's like almost touching his head until there's another snap. And this time it is Thad's right thigh that snaps. This kind of torture would continue throughout the night for a while. And then Joe would just change all of a sudden. And he would start to tend to Thad's wounds with lots of socks and bandages. For some reason he thought like, oh, this will do the trick. It didn't, clearly. He has broken bones. But in Joe's head, he was like, I'm helping. Joe said that he liked to do this so that way he could re-break the bones. Disgusting, I know. But Joe would even be like so nice to Thad that he'd be like, oh, let's watch a TV show together and talk like we've been friends our whole lives. So just weird. It doesn't make any sense, but that's what he did. So Joe eventually falls asleep and Thad tries to escape again. He tries to stand up, but the pain is just so intense that he almost throws up and passes out. So he sits back down, and unfortunately that's where he remains the rest of the night. He does not sleep the entire night. He is too scared, and that is completely understandable. So when Joe wakes up in the morning, Thad is trying to be his best friend so that way he doesn't get tortured again. And this works for about 2 hours until Joe just gets those rage-filled eyes again, and Thad knows exactly what's coming. So Joe drags Thad up the stairs, back onto the bed in the bedroom, and starts to now break his left leg. This caused Thaddeus to have an adrenaline rush, and he ends up punching Joe in the back. And this causes Joe to be just completely enraged, and he grabs a pillow and puts it over Thad's face and says, pretty much, if you try that again, or if you try to escape again, I'm gonna break your back or your neck. So later that day, Joe leaves for a while, and Thad is like, okay, this is my chance. So he drags himself off the bed, drags himself to the stairs, and tries to go down with his legs first, like you do when you're a toddler first learning how to go down the stairs. And this just does not work. So Thad's like, okay, I know what I have to do. And he just continuously throws himself down the stairs, going in and out of consciousness, and he finally makes it. And he drags himself all the way to the kitchen. Unfortunately, right when he gets to the kitchen, Joe comes home with his girlfriend, and they stay in the living room. And Thaddeus just stays quiet as a mouse. He does not say anything. He does not do anything, which I found kind of strange because I thought in my head, I was like, I would make as much noise as possible if there was another person in the house. But Thad was only 13 or 14 years old at the time. So he may have been like, no way, like this could be an accomplice. You know, he could do even worse things to her. Like, you know, he could have been thinking a lot of things. So at the same time, I do understand why he didn't say or do anything at that moment. Unfortunately, after Joe's girlfriend left, he did find Thaddeus in the kitchen and was incredibly upset and pretty much told Thad that everything that he had done to him up to that point was just a warm-up and that he was going to pay for it the next day. So the next day, Thad decides to try and distract Joe while he's inflicting more pain upon him, and asks Joe, hey, have you had any like previous victims? Have you had people that you've done this to? And Joe's like, yeah, like obviously. He was like, yeah, I did it to this Chris Steiner kid. And Thad would remember this name in the future. But at that time, somehow Thaddeus knew that Joe was waiting for his girlfriend. So he was like, oh, Joe, I think I hear somebody outside. So Joe would stop inflicting pain upon Thaddeus and go to the window to check. So Thad would do this frequently to kind of distract Joe so that way he wouldn't keep hurting him, which actually was really a smart idea. So kudos to Thaddeus for that one. On July 30th, that same day, Joe was going to leave with his girlfriend. So he wanted to make sure that Thaddeus could not escape. So he took Thaddeus into the bathroom and shoved him in the closet and locked him inside. And then just left with his girlfriend. He was like, bye. Thaddeus was like, okay, this is it. Gotta get out of this closet. I have to get out of here. I have to get downstairs and call the police. He searches around the closet for anything, any sort of weapon he could find. And he ends up finding an electric guitar and bashes the door down. He bashes the door down. He drags himself to the stairs, and he knows that he has to do the same thing he did over again. So he tosses himself down the stairs. He's in and out of consciousness once again, but he makes it, and he drags himself to the kitchen, and he sees a phone cord dangling down. So he grabs it, and, you know, he's flipping it around trying to get the phone to come down, and it comes down, and he grabs it, and he dials 911. And at first the police are like, is this a prank? Like, this is really specific and strange. Like, there's no way this is real. But they're like, we have to be sure. So the police are dispatched. They're on their way. They stay on the phone with Thaddeus, and they finally get to the house. They put Thad in an ambulance, and they realize that Thad only had about 2 hours left to live because of the internal bleeding in his legs. So had Thad wasted any more time than he did, it could have been a completely different ending to this story. When reunited with his parents, Thad immediately told his father about the previous victim of Joe's that he had mentioned. And he was like, it's Chris S. I know it's Chris S., but I can't remember the last name. So his dad gets a phone book, and they go through all the Chris S. names until they get to Steiner. And immediately, Thad is like, that's it. That's the kid. Like, that's who he talked about. So that night, Joe gets arrested at a bar on suspected murder of Chris Steiner and the kidnapping of Thaddeus. Because of the information they now have on Chris, they dug up his body and did another examination. They did an x-ray this time, which they hadn't done previously, and I'm not sure why. I found that a little strange, but anyway, they're doing an x-ray now. That's what matters. So they do an x-ray. They see that Chris has both legs are broken completely, and in very similar ways to Thaddeus. So they're like, oh, we got him. This is it. And they found out that his death was not drowning. It was actually asphyxiation. It would actually take almost a year to get enough evidence for Chris's trial, though. So it took a while. And during that time, Thaddeus was getting multiple surgeries done on his legs. And to this day, he actually still walks with a slight limp. Thaddeus was extremely eager to testify against Joe. That was like all he could think about while he was healing. And finally, his trial began. And he got up there and he told the court absolutely everything that happened to him. Joe actually said in the trial that he didn't remember doing any of that to Thaddeus, and that Thaddeus actually did it all to himself, which makes absolutely no sense. How is a 14-year-old boy going to break both of his legs in such a manner in multiple places to the point where he needs multiple surgeries? That makes no sense. That was the dumbest thing Joe could have said, and he said it because he's an idiot. Joe's attorney would actually try and plea insanity for Joe, but the police found evidence that Joe was completely in the know of what he was doing the entire time, because he wrote in a little journal the people that he was going to make victims of his crime, and he wrote previous victims' names already in that book as well, including Chris Steiner. In the book, he categorized them as get to know, can wait, and leg thing. So he just incriminated himself. I've noticed that serial killers or murderers in general, they like to incriminate themselves by doing things like this. And I like, why? Why? It's not a good idea. It's not smart, but I'm glad that they do it because then they get found and this sort of thing happens. After Thad's testimony, Joe was found guilty. He was sentenced to 100 years in prison, but people wanted him in there for longer. They wanted a life sentence. They wanted him in there completely forever. Because of this, Thaddeus was asked to testify against Joe in Chris's trial. And Thaddeus was totally fine with that. He was like, yes, let's put this guy away forever. A few days before Chris's trial began, Joe's neighbor Michael, he was 15 years old, he knocked on Thaddeus's door and Thad answered. And then he just decided to shoot Thad in the back twice. So he did that, and Thad lived. He lived. I'm not sure what happened to Michael. I know later in life he did get sentenced to 12 years in prison for sexually assaulting a young girl. But as far as what happened to him for this, I do not know. But anyway, Thad, alive, and injured, still goes to Chris's trial and testifies. This dude's a hero. Straight hero. Joe would be sentenced to 100 years in prison. He got a life sentence without parole, and he had a debt of $21 million to Thad and his family. Unfortunately, Thaddeus and his family still have not seen a single cent of this $21 million, which I think is absolute garbage and is not justice in any sense of the word. Like, it's not okay. Like, they deserve all that money for the medical bills and stuff like that. And for just the pain and suffering that Thaddeus had to go through. Like, hello, duh. For some reason, to this day, Joe still claims his innocence. Like, he'll go on podcasts and stuff and he'll be like, oh no, I'm completely innocent. There's so much evidence against him, it's ridiculous. Like I said, he incriminated himself. So I don't know how he's able to be like, no, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. Like, okay, dude, whatever. You're crazy. But thanks to Thaddeus, we now know what happened to Chris Steiner. But unfortunately, there were actually 2 more names that were on the list of victims that were scratched out, so they were never able to be identified. So that is really sad. So that's the case of the Bonebreaker. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, stay curious.